Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Dev Diary, where today we continue working on our Vampire Survivors clone featuring Candy. Now last time we continued adding more weapons from Vampire Survivors to our clone. Those weapons included some of the more odd bunch, such as the rascally cat that will fight anyone and anything, and the literal farting of flowers. It was a weird time all around. It was also decided that we no longer add any more weapons, so that we could finally focus on other aspects of the game, which brings us to today's session where we'll be doing just that. So to start, data entries for each and every weapon, its upgrades and descriptions for everything were added to a global reference list. This painstaking endeavor is almost a one-to-one copy of Vampire Survivors data, though some of it may be outdated, and the weapon descriptions were made up on the spot because it was faster to input, and we'll be changing it in the future anyway. A function was also added to generate each upgrade's description based on the arguments provided. It's not perfect, but for the sake of my sanity, it became necessary. Perk modifications were also stored in a global reference array for later use. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was just the beginning. Moving back to our controller, the perk level up system was also modified. First, a new array would be generated when the level up menu is called. This menu would then randomly choose 4 weapons or perks to display like in Vampire Survivors. The array was then referenced to determine the proper confirmation action. And again, it's here that another list of each action per level was added for each weapon in our clone. A switch and our level up function that we built in a previous episode made these additions as painless as possible, but there were still some snags, which I'll get to later in the video. For now, just understand that this took a really long time to add. And not only that, but these additions also tweaked a bunch of the weapons and projectile code in various ways. Everything from timing to scale and the like needed touch-ups now that the upgrades would directly affect their values. And of course, once a perk was chosen and the menu is closed, the array is reset. Now, that was all I was able to get to in terms of additions this session. As little as it may seem, these additions ended up taking me roughly 2 to 3 times as long to implement than a usual session. So with that said, let's talk about the big mistake I discovered in doing all this. And when I began this project, I knew very little about how Vampire Survivors was built. There were obviously going to be differences in behavior and the like for various reasons, but a lot of potential discrepancies were considered lower priority issues, those that would be solved when the time came. Well, the time came, and regret is the best way that I can describe things. Now, as I understand it, upgrades in Vampire Survivors seems to be calculated from base stats. Though that sounds obvious when saying it out loud, this was indeed an oversight on my part from the very beginning. Instead of defining base stats for each weapon, stats were treated as values that could be changed, without a need to reference the original values at any point. Meaning that none of the weapons added have actual base stats, meaning that the upgrades don't work like they should. For example, increasing a projectile speed by 20% means nothing when the weapon was previously increased by 20% last level. That is, unless we assume that the changed value is what determines the increase of the newer value. Even if that is the case, there were other areas that were also overlooked. For example, projectiles required a bunch of extra tweaking to get working with things such as scale and duration. Most could be salvaged, but others will require more tweaks and additional code to compensate. So in case it needs spelling out, I messed up, like big time. It's yet another case of not properly planning things out from the start and taking way too many things for granted. Now, while this project is so far from broken, we're going to have to pivot hard on the way that we handle things. For example, upgrades will have to be tweaked to heavily work without base stat references. Now, upon further reflection, this is probably for the best. This allows us more creative freedoms that aren't limited to the original behaviors and upgrades for each weapon, but still, as someone who tried so hard and spent so long trying to recreate the experience to a certain degree, it's disappointing. However, looking on the bright side, this really encourages us to get creative, so let's look at it as a happy accident. But for now, I needed a break from potential despair, so this brings us to the end of today's Dev Diary. So if you enjoyed today's entry, consider leaving a like, be sure to also subscribe and hit that bell if you haven't already, and hopefully today my unfortunate revelation helps you avoid something similar in the future. In fact, let me know if you've ever experienced something similar in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.